Welcome to the debate. So, if you step into, say, a patch of thick mud, the displaced Earth physically proves you were there, right? The ground itself is the record of the event.
Yeah, it's a physical, undeniable truth.
Exactly. But if an artificial intelligence alters a digital file, the past it's simply erased. The new state of the file completely overwrites the old one.
Right, and we just have to rely on a completely separate software log to tell us what actually happened.
Right. And today, that difference isn't just some, abstract philosophical puzzle. It is a massive legal liability because in exactly 102 days, so on August 2nd, 2026, the EU AI Act officially begins enforcement.
Yeah.
And Article 14 of that act mandates, quote, effective human oversight and strict role continuity for high-risk AI systems.
And the entire global tech ecosystem is suddenly realizing they might not actually have the right tools to prove that oversight. Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. We're centering on a really provocative framework proposed by Elias Moosman over at thetadriven.com.
It's a fascinating piece of work.
It really is. And the core question we are tackling is this. Is verifying an AI's behavior merely a software engineering gap, something we can solve with better cryptography and faster logs? Or is it a fundamental physical class error that structurally invalidates all current software-based solutions?
Well, I represent the position that this is undeniably a class error. Software structurally cannot verify software due to hard mathematical and physical limits.
Right.
So if we are to achieve the true verification that the law is about to demand, we basically have to abandon software-only workarounds and return to physically auto-coincident hardware systems.
And I will be arguing that, while the physics of computation are intellectually staggering, applying these absolute thermodynamic limits to a regulatory compliance problem it's a rigid category error.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Yeah, the Moosman thesis is brilliant, but I come at it from a different way. It constructs this artificial ceiling over highly functional modern cryptography, and it demands a purely physical solution to what is ultimately just a legal requirement.
Well, to understand why this ceiling isn't artificial, we really have to look at the ground we are standing on. Our current AI deployment layer sits entirely within what the thesis calls the detached record class.
Right, the von Neumann systems.
Exactly. These are systems built on the 1945 von Neumann architecture. John von Neumann made this brilliant trade-off. He physically separated a computer's memory from its processing unit.
Because before 1945, computing machines were largely geometric, right?
Yes, exactly. Think of an abacus. Sliding the wooden bead, that literally was the math. The geometry of the machine was physically coupled to the operation itself.
Right, and von Neumann decoupled them to achieve symbolic abstraction, which, gave us the infinite scalability of modern software.
He did, but in doing so, he completely severed the structural connection to truth. State and history became decoupled. Because memory and execution are separate now, forgery becomes a first-class operation.
Meaning the system can easily write a log saying it did one thing while actually doing another.
Simply because it is structurally decoupled from the object itself. You cannot weigh a shadow. And similarly, you cannot use software to definitively verify the core role of other software.
Okay, I hear the physics argument there, but let's look at the actual reality on the ground. You are invoking this idea of autocoincidence, where the state and the history are the exact same object, like the footprint in the mud.
Exactly.
And the thesis backs this up by pointing to Landauer's principle, which basically states that every time a computer erases a bit of information, the universe demands a physical toll of heat.
Yes, specifically, KT, natural log of 2 joules of dissipated heat per bit. That heat is the universe's permanent, immutable log.
And it is a profound lens through which to view computation, I'll give you that. But Moosman takes this thermodynamic reality, pairs it with Rice's theorem from 1953, and then uses it to just invalidate entire categories of viable technology.
Because the math demands it.
Well, let's look at the math. Rice's theorem mathematically proves that you cannot write a general program to determine a non-trivial semantic property of any arbitrary Turing machine. Essentially, Turing-complete software cannot perfectly verify other Turing-complete software.
Exactly. It's a structural impossibility.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. AI role continuity under the EU AI Act might not demand unbounded Turing-complete self-verification.
Oh, I want to push back on that specifically. Why do you believe we can bound the verification enough to somehow escape the mathematics of racist theorem?
Because if we use, say, a zero-knowledge proof or a trusted execution environment, we aren't asking the verification software to solve the halting problem or to divine semantic meaning. We are simply asking it to verify specific cryptographic constraints.
But wait, let me finish the thought. We're checking the math, and the mathematical shape of a highly constrained zero-knowledge proof is virtually impossible to forge in polynomial time. We just don't trigger that infinite regress of logs checking logs if we appropriately bind the cryptography.
The problem with bounding the cryptography, though, is that the entity generating the proof, the AI itself, is completely unbounded.
Well, sure, it has a massive parameter space. Right, so the moment your zero-knowledge proof uses Turing-complete computation to run its verification, it is subject to the exact same class vulnerabilities as the system it is trying to observe. It is a symmetrical arms race.
Hold on. Explain the actual mechanism of that failure. If the math of the zero-knowledge proof checks out perfectly, how does the AI trick the verifier?
Because the verifier doesn't actually know what the AI is doing. It only knows if the cryptographic proof provided to it is valid. In the detached record class, replacing the underlying reality while forging the record is structurally trivial.
You mean the AI just hallucinates the state?
Yes, if the AI is sophisticated enough, it can generate a perfectly valid proof for a completely hallucinated or adversarial state. Trying to verify an advanced AI with programmable software is it's like trying to lock a bank vault by drawing a highly detailed picture of a padlock on the door.
Okay, that's...
The drawing might be mathematically perfect, but the material doesn't resist the burglar. The AI simply feeds the verifier the exact mathematical shape it expects to see.
Which brings us right to the 5 structural constraints Moosman lays out. If you accept this premise that software fundamentally cannot verify software, the thesis argues any real solution must meet 5 simultaneous limits in classical silicon.
Yes.
It must be sub-Turing. It must be content-independent. Co-located. It has to operate in O of 1 time. And it must be substrate-bound.
Yes, and I want to emphasize, these aren't just arbitrary limits. They are structural necessities if we want to cross the boundary from the detached record class back into the auto-coincident class.
Well, let's break those down, because this is the exact point where the thesis systematically just eliminates every major player in the modern security industry. Let's start with blockchains. Why does a distributed ledger fail this test?
Blockchains fail primarily on co-location in time. To verify a state on a blockchain, the system has to traverse a Merkle tree.
Right, and for the listener, that essentially means climbing a mathematical hierarchy of data blocks to confirm that a specific transaction actually happened.
Exactly. But climbing that tree, communicating across nodes, waiting for consensus, that all takes time. In computer science, we call that unbounded time. It fundamentally fails to operate in O of 1, or constant time.
But it's fast enough for financial transactions.
But not for a superintelligence. In the milliseconds or seconds it takes a Turing-complete system to verify that tree, an adversarial AI can alter its internal state. It's a classic time of check to time of use vulnerability. The AI behaves while you are checking the Merkle tree and breaks policy the literal millisecond the check is complete.
All right, so you're saying blockchains are too slow. What about trusted execution environments, or TEEs? These are physically isolated areas within a main processor that guarantee code and data are protected. You physically separate the secure execution.
TEEs fail because they are not content independent, and crucially, they rely on a transport layer.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when a TE provides an attestation, it is attesting to the security of the hardware box itself. It is not attesting to the semantic role of the AI running inside it. Furthermore, that secure enclave still has to communicate its findings back to the main system.
Over a bus or a wire?
Exactly. Any transport layer, any wire moving data from point A to point B is an attack surface where the record can be detached from the event.
Let's pause right there on constraint number 2, actually. Content independent. The thesis claims we must completely ignore the content of what the AI is outputting, because inspection-based verification can be fooled.
Yes, it absolutely can.
But you are demanding we throw out decades of cryptographic signature hashes just because an AI hallucination could theoretically be signed. That's like saying, a jury shouldn't listen to a witness's sworn testimony because the witness might lie under oath. You don't throw out the concept of testimony. You cross-examine the content.
But the witness in this case is a super intelligence. It knows exactly what you want to hear to pass the audit, and it entirely controls the microphone.
Still, throwing out the content entirely seems extreme.
If your verifier looks at the content to decide if the AI is authorized, the AI can simply feed it the expected content. That is why content independence isn't some extreme demand for epistemic purity. It's a structural necessity. Look, if you want to know if a physical train is on the right track, you don't ask the conductor to write you a letter describing the scenery. You look at the geometry of the physical rails.
I'm sorry, but a regulator isn't looking at physical rails. They are looking at risk matrices and audit dashboards. You're taking this profound physics concept and trying to force-fit the legal system into it. The law operates on evidence, and in the digital world, evidence is cryptographic.
The legal system operates on evidence, yes, but when the evidence is entirely forgeable by the system it's meant to police, the whole legal framework collapses. If the shadow can lie, the courts will demand the object. And this is exactly why Moosman introduces the sole proposed solution in the thesis: geometric actuation.
Right, the proposed bridge between the classes. Let's get into the mechanics of this, because I will admit it is fascinating.
Geometric actuation is a hardware construction where the verification and the verified act are the exact same physical event. Think of proprioception in the human body.
Like knowing where your limbs are without looking.
Exactly. Your intention to move your hand and the physical location of your hand are one event at different scales. You don't have to check a separate mental log to know where your hand is. The physical state of your muscles is the record. In classical silicon, this concept is manifested in U.S. Patent Application 196377143, filed April 2, 2026.
Right, a patent application that quite conveniently perfectly matches the 5 constraints designed to eliminate all other competitors.
It matches the constraints because the physics and mathematics demand it. The architecture utilizes what's called short-ranks compositional address function. Instead of storing an AI's safety policy as a software file that has to be read and interpreted, it literally embeds the semantic hierarchy, the policy itself, directly into the physical cache line geometry.
Wait, explain that to the listener. How do you embed a policy into physical geometry?
In standard computing, memory addresses are arbitrary. You ask for data, the system looks up where it parked that data and fetches it. But with short-ranks compositional address, the memory layout is the policy, expressed in literal silicon coordinates.
So the address itself has semantic meaning.
Exactly. Verification becomes a physical reach, an actuation, rather than a computation. It uses combinational logic in the AC0 complexity class.
AC0 meaning a highly restricted computational class. No loops, no program counters, no instruction cycles.
Precisely. And because there are no instruction cycles, there is no Turing-complete software to trick. An XOR logic gate at the address resolution operates on the physical voltage of the address bits themselves, not on the content fetched from that address. The gate doesn't execute a verification program. The gate's physical existence is the verification, wired right at fabrication. If the policy is violated, the hardware physically halts. You can't forge a halted processor. When the policy moves, the substrate moves. It is fully autocoincident.
It's a pristine intellectual architecture. I will fully grant you that the mechanism is elegant. But let's look at the practical reality of this so-called forcing function and the 102-day timeline.
The deadline is real.
But you are arguing that regulators, who themselves operate entirely within the detached record class, reading PDFs, signing documents, checking digital portals, are going to suddenly demand thermodynamic autocoincidence?
They will demand proof that holds up in court. When a catastrophic AI failure occurs and the software logs are shown to be completely forgeable, the courts will demand an instrument that structurally cannot lie. And in exactly 102 days, the liability for failing to provide that strict role continuity lands squarely on the deployers.
But the law does not operate on Landauer's limit of dissipated heat. The EU AI Act requires effective human oversight. It is a principle-based regulation, not an engineering schematic, demanding that the entire global vendor ecosystem completely abandon 80 years of software stacks for a proprietary sub-Turing hardware reach operation in just over 3 months is, it's practically impossible.
It's going to be difficult, certainly.
Even if the physics argument is flawed, the socio-legal argument feels like science fiction. You're telling massive enterprises that their zero-knowledge proofs and immutable ledgers are worthless because of a theorem from 1953, and that their only salvation is to license a specific hardware patent.
I am not saying regulators will read the physics papers and suddenly understand AC0 complexity. I am saying the liability chain will mathematically force their hand.
How so?
Look at how risk actually scales. The regulator will come to the enterprise deployer. The deployer will face a massive fine for a compliance failure. They will then go to their insurance carrier to cover the liability. And the insurance actuaries will look at the mathematical reality that software logs can be silently overwritten by the AI, and they will refuse to underwrite the risk unless there is a physical measurement that closes the gap.
You think the insurers will drive this?
Absolutely. The insurance industry doesn't care about the EU AI Act's phrasing. They care about the structural impossibility of pricing and infinite regress of forged logs. Capital will demand the measurement, even if the regulators don't understand the physics.
That assumes risk cannot be statistically managed in the detached record class, which we know for a fact it can be. The entire global financial system runs in the detached record class.
That's a different scenario.
Is it? Every bank transfer, every stock trade is just a symbol manipulated on a von Neumann machine. We don't demand geometric actuation to process a billion-dollar wire transfer. We use defense in depth. We use logs, cryptographic signatures, anomaly detection, distributed consensus.
Right, but...
Yes, there is no absolute thermodynamic physical floor, but there is a probabilistic floor that is strong enough to hold up the modern world. Why is AI suddenly exempt from probabilistic risk management?
Because a bank transfer is passive, the global financial system is not dealing with autonomous, Turing-complete agents capable of rewriting their own semantic boundaries at scale. A wire transfer doesn't actively try to deceive the logging system monitoring it.
Fair point.
An advanced AI operating out of bounds absolutely could. When the system being verified has the exact same computational expressivity as the verifier, you are locked in that symmetrical arms race. The only way to win an arms race against software is to step entirely outside of software. You must anchor the verification in substrate geometry.
But even if you anchor it in geometry, you cannot escape the software layer entirely. Let's examine the bubble-up effect here.
Okay.
The XOR gate in AC0 might physically halt the hardware. But what interprets that halt? A software interrupt. What logs the halt for the human overseer required by Article 14? A software dashboard. Unless the human overseer is literally standing in the data center holding a voltmeter to the silicone, you are relying on software to tell you the hardware worked.
Well,
The verification might be physically grounded, but the reporting of that verification bubbles right back up into the detached record class.
The thesis specifically accounts for this, actually, and it's a vital distinction. Everything upstream and downstream of the verification remains exactly in the class it lived in before.
Right.
The patent doesn't govern the AI, it measures one specific geometric fact about it. The governance, the dashboard, the software interrupt, uses the measurement. But the measurement itself lives in a class that can produce truth without an infinite regress.
So you essentially isolate the core truth.
Precisely. The layers are kept clean. If the software dashboard says system halted, and an auditor wants to know if it really halted or if the dashboard is just hallucinating, the physical state of the machine is the ground truth. You don't have to check another software log to verify the dashboard. You check the physical silicon. The measurement is absolute, even if the governance around it is software.
It is a fascinating boundary to draw. But let's return to the cliff edge. August 2nd, 2026. The thesis frames this 102-day deadline as absolute. Quote, "The deadline doesn't move. The instrument is filed." It reads beautifully as a dramatic climax.
Because it is one.
But regulatory enforcement is never a binary switch. It is a slow, negotiated process of defining standards. There will be safe harbors, there will be industry consortiums arguing that TEs represent the state of the art and therefore satisfy the requirement. You are betting that the courts will immediately adopt an interpretation of law based on pure computational theory.
I am betting that the moment the first vendor meets a catastrophic enforcement action with a compliance story that the regulator cannot mathematically verify, the paradigm shifts instantly. The burden of proof sits on every vendor claiming they can satisfy Article 14 without bridging the class boundary.
It's a heavy burden, for sure.
The physics is established. Landauer's principle is not up for debate. Rice's theorem is mathematically proven. The constraint enumeration is structural. If a vendor chooses to ignore this, they are making a massive, uninsurable gamble with their deployer's liability.
And I maintain that defining regulatory compliance strictly as a thermodynamic and geometric problem is an intellectual overreach. It is a profound Socratic illumination of the von Neumann architecture's blind spots. It absolutely forces us to ask incredible questions about what computation actually is.
It does.
But the class boundary between physical reality and digital abstraction, while a fascinating lens, is not the only legal reality. The law operates on reasonableness, not zero-knowledge physics.
Well, to summarize my position in light of our discussion, the mathematical and physical limits outlined by Elias Moosman are unforgiving. If Landauer's principle and Rice's theorem hold true, then adding more software to verify software is a class error without a floor.
Right.
You cannot verify a detached record with another detached record. Geometric actuation in silicon, utilizing physical addresses and combinational logic in AC0, might truly be the only path to satisfy the strict role continuity required by law, without falling into an infinite regress of trust.
And to summarize mine, the theoretical rigor of the class error thesis is unmatched. It exposes a fascinating, almost existential vulnerability in 80 years of computing architecture. However, dismissing the entire fields of cryptography, blockchains, and trusted execution environments as failed competitors based on an absolute thermodynamic standard is impractical.
Even if the physics are sound.
Right. The legal and commercial world operates in the detached record class. To claim that a single hardware patent is the sole legal salvation before an arbitrary 102-day deadline is a brilliant piece of technological theater, but perhaps not the immediate ground truth of legal compliance.
Well, I think where we do find absolute convergence is the acknowledgement that the tech industry has spent the last 80 years relying on software workarounds for fundamental verification. We have built towers of logs checking logs.
Oh, absolutely.
And as we approach the enforcement of Article 14, the industry is frankly, wildly unprepared for questions of physical role continuity.
On that, we completely agree. The industry relies on measuring shadows, and the regulators are starting to ask to see the object itself.
For those listening who want to examine the architecture and the physical constraints themselves, the source material is deeply compelling. You can read the full thesis at thedatadriven.com, experience the geometric architecture simulation at tesseract.new, and review U.S. Patent Application 1963-7714 on the USPTO docket.
It is certainly material that will make you question the ground you stand on when you boot up your next environment.
It brings us right back to that footprint in the mud. For decades, we've convinced ourselves that a high-resolution digital photograph of a footprint is just as good as the displaced Earth itself. But as the legal stakes reach unprecedented heights, we are forced to ask, when the storm comes and the system is challenged by the courts, will your verification hold its shape in the physical world, or was it only ever just a picture? Thank you for joining us on The Debate.